according to the scientific model. And I believe that science is the contemporary language of mysticism. I think science is the greatest way to explain the unexplainable. And if you blend the concepts of quantum physics that says that your subjective mind has an effect on the objective world, and you combine it with the concepts of neuroplasticity, in other words, the brain has physical changes every time you learn something new or have new experiences or make new choices or demonstrate new behaviors or embrace new emotions, there are neurochemical changes, physical evidence that there's been some shift in consciousness. And consciousness leaves a footprint in the brain, and that's called the synaptic connection. That these concepts of psychoneuroimmunology and epigenetics all point the finger at possibility. And if you can combine those concepts, we're talking about knowledge. And knowledge is power, but knowledge about yourself is self-empowerment. And so tonight I'd like to demystify some concepts in meditation. And then I want to show you tomorrow night some of the research that we've been doing over the last 2 years in studying common people doing the uncommon. And I brought in teams of researchers and scientists and technicians in my advanced workshops because we were seeing so many supernatural changes in people's health and in their lives that I wanted to begin to measure it. And when I began to measure the changes, we were all astounded to see the results that people were producing. And so I want to start off by laying some foundations this evening, and then tomorrow I'll show you some of the neuroscience and some of the research and show you how powerful you really are in the process of transformation. How does that sound? So the word meditation, if you look up that word in the Tibetan culture, the word meditation literally means, that symbol literally means to become familiar with. Familiarization. So if you're sitting in your meditation and you all of a sudden start to notice certain thoughts that aren't serving you, and those thoughts are coming up every single day, and all of a sudden, instead of putting your attention on those thoughts as if they were true, you began to observe those thoughts, then it would beg the question, who's doing the observing? In other words, you're not the program in that moment, but you are beginning to become the consciousness observing the program, and you begin to objectify your subjective self. And if you sat down in a meditation every day, and you became aware of your urges and your propensities and the things that you wanted to do, and the body, the animal, you were making it sit there, stay, don't go, and keep bringing it back to the present moment, the more conscious you become of those unconscious behaviors and habits, the more you are knowing yourself and you're becoming familiar with the old self. And if you could pay attention to the emotions of impatience and frustration and unworthiness and self-doubt, and you became conscious that those emotions are just residue from past experiences, and the body has been conditioned to be the mind of those emotions, and you kept bringing the body back into the present moment, and you were not settling for the body as the mind. If you kept doing that, would you agree you would begin to become more familiar with the old self, so that in your waking day, in your conscious life, you wouldn't let any thought slip by your awareness to cause you to go unconscious again? And the research that's being done at Yale University has proven that when people move into a state of meditation and they find the present moment, there are specific circuits in your brain called the default mode networks. And those default mode networks are the chatter that you hear in your head all day long, the voice that's talking to you. And just 20 to 30 minutes of meditation, and average people began to shut off the default mode mechanisms and networks in their brain. Well, that would make sense, because the whole purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But here's the cool part. Those people who are able to shut those networks off, and the chatter in their head, the voice that was always talking to them, shut off during their meditation, that network stayed off the remainder of the day while they were interacting in their environment, which means they're less analytical, They're less judgmental. They're less critical because the very circuits in their brain that usually fire have been tempered in their meditation. How many people understand that? So then, when you begin to become familiar with your old self and you begin to observe it, you become more conscious of your unconscious self. It means you're less likely to go unconscious in your waking day. And if you began to ask yourself a simple question like, what is the greatest ideal of myself that I can be today? What is the greatest contribution I could present to the world today? How could I live this day as one great life? And you began to think about a new way of being. And you began to plan your actions. And you began to contemplate what you learned philosophically. Because knowledge is the precursor to experience. And as you begin to review what you're no longer going to do, and you begin to think about what you are going to do, you silence the circuits in your brain that are connected to the old self, and nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together, and you're literally pruning apart the circuits that are connected to the old you. And as you begin to plan your behaviors and think about a new way of being, and as you begin to mentally rehearse how you're going to live that day, the research shows that when you begin to rehearse in your mind, your brain begins to look like the experience has already occurred. And as I said last night, once you begin to install those neurological circuits, you're putting the hardware in place. If you keep revisiting them, nerve cells that fire together, wire together, you begin to install a software program and you prime your brain into the future. Now you warmed your brain up. And if you practice that every day, it would begin to become familiar to you. And if you said to yourself, how would the mystic, the saint, a holy person, the great leader, live her day or his day today? And you began to teach your body emotionally what that future would feel like ahead of the actual experience, your body, as the unconscious mind, would begin to believe it's living in that future reality in the present moment, and you're signaling new genes in new ways because the chemical feedback that you're creating by thought alone, your body literally is getting new information. And when that occurs, your body is literally beginning to live in the future. And once those genes are signaled, those genes make new proteins, and now your body's prepared for the event. And if you practice loving kindness and compassion and strength and conviction and empowerment and invincibility and self-love every single day, and you cultivated those chemical states and you practiced it over and over again, it would begin to become familiar to you. And so the process of transformation is unlearning and relearning. It's breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. It's pruning synaptic connections, as we say in neuroscience, and sprouting new connections. It's unfiring and unwiring, and refiring and rewiring. It's unmemorizing emotions that are stored in the body and then recondition the body to a new mind and to a new emotion. It's literally pulling your energy out of the past and beginning to set your energy and your intention into a new future. And so then, to become familiar with is the Tibetan word for meditation. In Sanskrit, the word means to cultivate self. So think about this. If you were going to plant a garden, and you looked at the garden from last year, and you saw the dead plants from the past year, and the weeds that had grown because no one was paying attention, and you noticed the rocks that sifted to the top, that blocked the flow of life, and you saw the soil was hardened and uncultivated, and you cast seeds, planted seeds, and threw them on that garden, what type of fruit would you yield? But if you began to pull out those plants from the past, and you began to look at those weeds of unconscious thoughts that have been slipping by your attention every single day because you've been too distracted by your environment, and you began to move those blocks, that emotional blocks that block the flow of the divine in you, and you began to soften and temper the soil like the body, Now you're ready to plant seeds. And so to know thyself is the concept of meditation. And the more we begin to build a new idea based on ancient wisdom about what mystics and saints have known about for thousands of years, then people will begin to do the supernatural. And I have been studying these concepts for many, many years, and I can tell you finally that this is a time in history where people no longer just want to know, they want to know how.